Yeah, we're on. Excellent, excellent. I just managed to lose myself from the frame, but I'm going to fix that in just a bit and turn off the noise. Okay, hopefully everyone can see and hear me. It looks good on my end, but who knows what it looks in other parts of the world. Welcome to this month's live stream, and today's topic is: can you successfully sew knits with just a regular good old sewing machine? And I know there are lots of opinion on this and lots of tips and tricks, so that's what I would love that we could talk about this evening. Just share all those cool tips and also have a discussion about what you actually can achieve and perhaps not achieve using a regular sewing machine. Anyways, I love if you say hi in the chat, who you are and where you're from. That's really cool because we usually have an audience from, pretty much all over the world. So that's also a great bonus about that. We can also share so many things on a global level. So that's really cool as well in this live stream. We have Stan. Hi, Stan. I am from Rochester in New York. Hi, Stan. We have Charlene from Oxford in the UK. We have Beach Baby from Carlsbad in California. We have Bettina from Hamburg in Germany. We have Sherry from Washington State. We have Libby from California. And she says she's so happy to be sewing during the live stream today. That's so fun. I love the idea of we actually kind of sewing together when we're doing this. That just makes it even more fun because it was such a fun community. And we have Margaret from Northern Ireland. Hi, Margaret. And we have a collection of Unsewn Nature from Malmö. Nelly. Hi, Nelly. And Ran from Santa Barbara in California. We have Catherine from Berlin, Germany. We have Susanne from Sävedalen, that's close to where I'm living. And we have Susan, sorry, I'm starting to speak Swedish now. Susan from New Zealand. And we have Linda from Texas. Oh, we're so many people in the chat now. I'm trying to keep up. I'm sorry if I miss anyone because sometimes I'm not a quick reader. We have Lisano from Fresno, and we have Marianne from Sölvesborg. That's Swedish, that's why I changed the accent there. Jan from Virginia, Barbara from Texas, Jackie from Texas as well. We have Auntie Stitches, soggy greetings from Norfolk in England. I love that. And we have another Johanna here from Fagersta in Sweden, Paul Smith. And he says, love your videos, Paul from Norfolk. Thank you so much, Paul. We have Leslie from Vancouver in British Columbia, right, BC. And we have Shaki from Brazil, which is living in Canada. And Sherry's canning tomatoes right now. And she is about to sew a sweatshirt for her grandson. And we have Rita from California. And coming out loud and clear, we have Rode. Hi, Rode. We met in New York. Hi, Johanna. We have Heather from North Yorkshire in the UK. And we have KGL from watching from South Africa. And we have Rodias, hi, from Brooklyn in New York. So again, a pretty global gathering of sews. So that's super, super great. So what I want to discuss today is, can you really sew with knits using a regular sewing machine? Because to be honest, it's great to have a Coverstitch machine. It's great to have a serger, but both these are big investments. First of all, and secondly, they also take up a ton of space. So a lot of us will end up in the conundrum of, if we start sewing more and more with knits, we start to think about, okay, should I get a serger? Should I get a Coverstitch machine? Is my sewing machine really all that good? And that's really a tough decision to make because, as I said, it's a big investment. So I thought that we're going to, first of all, I'm going to ask you guys, what are your thoughts about that? Can you successfully sew knits with a regular sewing machine? And please also tell me why you think you can, or perhaps why you think you're not, and also if you have opinions about limitations and stuff like that. I really like to know and get your 2 cents about this topic. What are your experience when it comes to using a sewing machine for sewing just regular knits, stretchy knits, and all other type of knits that are available? And first of all, I'm going to talk about my personal opinion on this topic. Now I'm going to give you the boring answer. I say it depends. I wish I was one of those categorical person would be just, of course you can, and of course you can't. But I would say it kind of depends. I would say that you can absolutely sew most knit fabrics using a sewing machine, but it depends on both the fabric choices and of course your expectations of the end result. Because if you are, for instance, sewing like very stretchy spandex lycra knits, or very like soft ribbing, which has not much recovery, it's very like shapeless, then I will say, to be honest, using a regular sewing machine will not yield the same result as a cover stitch machine or a serger. That's just the way it is. But if you can live with slightly wobblier seam, a little bit of puckering here and there, perhaps a little bit tunneling in the hemming, then I'd say definitely. And now I'm just talking about the really difficult kind of knits. When I am talking about like double knit, sweatshirt fabric, French terry, piqué fabric, I think it's called, the one that you use for polo shirt, lots of other like more stable knits, I would say you can definitely, in my opinion, use a regular sewing machine just as well. And of course, sometimes it can also, how shall I say, it can make the sewing experience much more smooth, because having to switch back and forth between 2 or even 3 machines, like in my case, that can really drain. I mean, it can kind of, you miss the flow a bit, right? It doesn't feel as smooth as if you can set up one machine and just do changes between, say, some stitches and perhaps the presser foot. But apart from that, I just wish perhaps that I was able to sew more with the sewing machine. And the reason why a sewing machine is a little bit limited is because I would say primarily, in my opinion, is the way it feeds the fabric, how the feed dogs feed the fabric. Because compared to a serger or a cover stitch machine, you're able to adjust the speed of the feed dogs, how they feed. So you have you can control the feeding of both layers of the fabric, and you can adjust that. Whereas I think, you correct me, because to be honest, I'm a bit of a Ludette when it comes to sewing machines, because this is the newest sewing machine I've ever owned, and this one is from 1989. So it could have happened some things, but normally you cannot really control that unless you're using a walking foot. So that is probably the biggest problem. I would say that you will get a slightly stretched out situation, because it's a little bit hard to control those stretchy fabrics. But again, that's just one type of fabrics that is difficult. For a lot of other type of fabrics, I would say you can do perfectly fine with a sewing machine. And I actually have here a cardigan that I did. It's actually 10 years ago now. I made it in 2009, and it's on my blog because I've been blogging since 2008. But this one is entirely sewn on a sewing machine. So I'm going to go through that in a bit now and just check your comments about your thoughts about this. I'm going to tell you all the type of seams and techniques and stabilizers, all that stuff that I used so that I was able to sew this. And it has quite a good amount of stretch, but it's not super stretchy. So now I'm going to see now what you guys are saying about this topic. And also hello to everyone else who said hi in the chat as well. I had a little problem in keeping up with you guys, but there are people here from Miami, Houston, Ottawa, Serbia, Connecticut, Ireland. So hi everyone. So cool to see that you all guys are here tonight. Or day, obviously. I'm a little bit limited here because in Sweden it's 8 o'clock in the evening, but of course it's a lot of different time zones. Sorry about that. Anyway, Stan says, I have both a regular 4-thread serger and a combo serger with cover stitch and a double chain stitch. They're perfect for working with knits. Yes, obviously that combination, it just will make the result much more professional. And Johanna says, I started sewing clothes for my kids on a regular standard budget sewing machine, and they have turned out well for the kids, I think. Good to hear. Stan says, I love your book on the cover stitch machine. Thank you so much, Stan. Thank you so much. I have, even though we're going to talk about sewing machines today, I have also done a book about cover stitch machines. So if you're really interested in that, you can definitely check out my book, and you can also check out the videos I've done. And if you're interested about sewing or buying a cover stitch machine, you can also, I think I've managed to do that in the description, so I can link to a video which is a buyer's guide to cover stitch machine to make that decision a bit easier, perhaps, hopefully. And Alex says, how about 75% merino and 25% polyester? Alex, that's a great question. I would say it depends on how it is knitted. For instance, if it's a regular interlock fabric, like a t-shirt fabric without lycra or spandex, with stretch, but not crazy stretch, then you can definitely sew that using either just zigzag stitches, perhaps a narrow zigzag stitch for the side seams, or an overlock seam on the sewing machine. I'm going to talk about that just in a bit. And for hemming, I would definitely say either a zigzag stitch or a twin needle stitch. Those, right? But most other like functional wool sweaters and stuff, they usually have like a rib situation going on. Then it can be a little bit trickier, and so you need to, I'm going to talk about that in a bit. We're going perhaps use a little bit of a tips and tricks to keep the fabric in check. But I will say if you're doing like for instance, exercise top or well-fitted top that has negative ease, then if there is some puckering, the good thing about it is it will be stretched out. So when you look at it when it's not on your body, then you might get a little bit of puckering. But when you put it on the body, it will stretch out, and then you won't really notice those puckering, because that's usually when you stitch crosswise. That's usually where you end up a little bit of a conundrum when it comes to sewing on those really stretchy rib fabrics. Hope that answers your question, Alex. And Johanna, who has been sewing on a regular sewing machine for many years, she said, now I got a surgery for my 30th birthday and I really love it though. Yeah, it does elevate things for sure. And Paul says, I use a regular sewing machine food knits a machine for cotton jersey using overcast, zigzag and a twin needle. The art with twin needle is slackening off the bobbin tension to eliminate the pin tuck effect. Yeah, Paul, that's a great point, because that is probably the tricky part, because I was actually, hopefully now you can actually see, because I have some examples here. Because one of the things is not just the puckering, it's also the tunneling. This is a sample. Now I'm going to have to look in my viewer so I can see if you can see this. This is an example that is sewn with a twin needle, made stretched twin needle on a sewing machine. And here I have kind of slacked off the bobbin tensions a bit. That's definitely something you might need to experiment to get it lie flat. It doesn't look as pretty, but it does make this one look a bit more flat. But when you see, if I tilt this, you can still see there's a slight ridge here, right? It's not big, but it's a little subtle ridge. And because this is on a very thin, stretchy fabric, then this little ridge will happen. Whereas this sample is done. It looks, on at first sight, it looks like pretty much the same, but this one is done on a Coverstitch machine. You can see here, if I tilt it like this, hopefully it makes some sense. There you can see it lies flat. You see there is not that ridge, the tunnel is much less prominent on the Coverstitch machine. And of course on the back side it looks a bit neater and flatter as well due to this, but to be honest, not a massive difference. Twin needle, Coverstitch. And also a couple of people have talked about my sewing machine, and this is a cool thing actually, I would say, with getting a sewing machine. This Bernina is from 1989, I think, according to the manual, and this is my youngest machine. And before that I had a Viking Husqvarna 2000, which was from the early 70s, and that had 2 or maybe even 3 type of stretch stitches. And remember, that was made, it's pretty much made the same year as I was made. So yeah, it's over 45 years old, and that could sew pretty great, because actually the cardigan I'm holding in my hand now, this one was actually sewn, I think, using my old 70s sewing machine. But the Bernina, which is a cool thing, so if you want to look into, I know that they are really quite expensive, those vintage models now, but if you want to get a good older sewing machine which has a lot of stretches, you should definitely look into the older Bernina ones, because I've counted and I see it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different stretch seams plus special settings for the twin needle. So in actually 6 different stretch stitches, and this was made 30 years ago. That's pretty cool, right? So it's what I'm trying to say here is, again, you don't necessarily have to go out and buy a new super expensive, super fancy machine just to be able to sew with knits. I have been able to do so by just using older machines. That's what I want to take home, because again, it's so expensive. I also try to be mindful about that, because it's so easy to be caught up with buying, thinking that you have to spend so much money, and good quality costs a lot of money, but definitely an alternative is to use or look for an older machine. You will probably get more value in the same price range, of course. Of course, a new Bernina is probably awesome, but they also cost a lot. Emma Easy says, I'm saving for both your books at the moment, but I've been waiting for your live stream here on demand videos. Thank you so much. I feel like I picked up some fantastic tips already. Thank you so much, Emma. Libby says, every summer I teach girls between 12 and 14 years old to sew swimsuits. We use regular sewing machine with the right needles and a few tricks. They come out really well. That's really great to hear, and I love to hear your tricks as well there, Libby, because that's really one of the things as well. You might want to sew with stretchy lycra. What are you using for type of stitches to make sure that they don't pop, and also that you won't get those stretched out wobbly seams. Anniken says, my experience is that as long as you can adjust the pressure on the pressure foot, it's working fine. I agree. Yes, that's a really good point, because speaking about older machine, my Bernina, I can't do that. So I have to use a lot of manipulation with my fingers to adjust the fabrics, because that's what I'm really curious to hear, you guys. If someone is interested in just using a sewing machine, they might want to know, are there actually some sewing machines that are better than others? And so I'd love to hear if you tell me in the chat what brands you've been using, so we can share that and see if there are actually ones that are better for sewing knits. Another thing that I know, that I think it's Bernina, they have something they call like dual feed, and I also know that some sewing machines has like a built-in walking foot feature, right? Is it Fuff? I might be wrong here, but I love to hear your experience with those sewing machines that has a bit more of a extra features that could be helpful when it comes to sewing with knits and controlling the feeding issue, which I think is the root of most problems when it comes to sewing with knits on a sewing machine. Let me see here. Alex says, could you recommend a twin needle width, for instance, for example, is 1.5 millimeter with more or less stretch than a 4 millimeter? I would imagine less. Yes, you're very right, Alex. I think that I usually use like a standard width between 2 and 2.5, I think. I'm just talking very roughly here, but definitely, as you say, a shorter stitch length has more points, anchor points, so you will have more stretch, whereas a longer stitch will have less. That's the same with the Coverstitch machine. If you have a longer stitch length, you will not have the same ability to stretch. But there is one drawback, I would argue, when it comes to sewing with a shorter stitch length, using both the sewing machine and the surgeries, that perhaps the feeding will not be as good. So I definitely think you need to find that sweet spot between how the best stitch length is. So even though, of course, normally, like a short length straight stitch will not have a lot of stretch, but because the zigzag stitch on the reverse side, when you're sewing with a twin needle, of course, if you have a shorter stitch length, you will have more points, and probably also, I would imagine, but don't quote me on it, it will be probably less prone of popping as well, because it has more of those zigzag stitches in the same distance. Now, I'm talking completely out of my hat perhaps, but it does make sense if it were that way, because it's definitely true when you're doing a cover stitch situation. That's definitely makes a big difference. Jan says, I struggle with neck bands lying flat and not stretching out on the neck. What machine is best? Well, Jan, I would definitely say that neckbands, a cover stitch machine, again, will be the preferred choice if you are able to get access to that, because then you can, again, control the differential feed and make that sure. But when you're sewing a neckband, for instance, in my book, Sewing Activewear, which is actually, even though it's called Sewing Activewear and it shows tutorials for sewing activewear, there are also lots and lots of tutorials in this book that shows how you sew knits with a regular sewing machine. So for instance, I have the tutorial for neckband ribbing and how you stitch that down when you stitch down the seam allowance. That's done in this book with using a twin needle, a regular sewing machine twin needle. So to get back to your point, Jan, it kind of a little bit depends on the fabric as well, because if you're using a more stable, like t-shirt knit, jersey knit, which doesn't have a lot of lycra, then you will usually be able to get it to lie flat more. In some cases, I actually have used spray starch. So what I do is just spray some starch on it, and because that sets, it gets much easier to control. And then when you rinse it away, it doesn't really affect the fabric, but it keeps it stable enough so that you won't get that sort of stretched out feed thing. Also, when you're sewing with twin needles, it's a good idea perhaps to control the fabric a little bit with your hands. That's what I was talking about. That's so hard to explain, but by sort of just keeping the fabric in check. Sometimes it's called thought, I think, when you're using your hands. So you have one hand behind, one hand in front. Now I'm going to make a really confusing explanation there. But so when you're sewing, you make sure that you just stretch, don't really drag it out, so you keep it in check, and that really helps as well. Another trick that I use, I'm going to say I talk about this in so many videos, but another trick I use sometimes is that I use an awl to feed the upper layer of the fabric, because that again keeps the fabrics evenly fed. I would love to know, because a walking foot on knits is not something that I have used a lot, but I know that some of you guys use that. So I would really like to know if a walking foot and a twin needle is a workable combination. Because if it is, then I can imagine that that should also work as well, to get back to your question, Jan. But you can definitely be successful with it, but if you're working with really stretchy fabric, it will be a bit more difficult. So there are lots of different ways of controlling knit fabrics, but sometimes you have to use a combination. Sometimes you can try basting it, just basting it a little bit taut, so it just keeps in check. So yeah, it's a little bit tricky for sure, but it can be done. And Candybeck says, hello, what is the best way to sew thick knitted fabric and knitted mesh lace, etc.? Well, there's a little bit different questions. I would say if you have, if it's like a sweater knit, for instance, I definitely like to use a narrow zigzag stitch. And when I say narrow zigzag stitch, I mean someone that hasn't the same large triangles. So I adjust this stitch width. This is an example of a more narrow zigzag stitch that's really good for sweater knits. I would not mess with one of those overlock seams on a sewing machine, go back and forth when you're sewing really thick and bulky knits, because it just feeds, it takes forever, and it just becomes so bulky, and you know, you don't really need that. You can achieve so much just using a regular zigzag stitch for that matter. But where it comes from mesh and lace and stuff, again, I would say a zigzag stitch is your probably best bet, because if you're using one of those stretch seams on really thin fabric like mesh, they have a tendency of curling and folding, and it's really hard to get both layers to lie flat on a sewing machine. I've found it all depends a bit on your presser foot you're using, but I would definitely do a lot of narrow zigzag stitching. I think narrow zigzag stitching is probably a very undervalued stitch for sewing with knits, and it also has pretty good stretchability and recovery. You can also do like 2 rows, which is when you do first a narrow zigzag stitch, and then for reinforcement you do a wider zigzag stitch at the edges, then you will have a seam that won't really pop, hopefully, but always do a test first. Paul Smith says, I loving your book, Master the Coverstitch. Thank you so much, Paul. And Jan says, I'm considering buying a dedicated cover stitch machine. I'm on the fence. I totally feel you. Definitely check reviews. And you can also, as I said, check my video where I talk about the 3 type of cover stitch machine models that is out there. And also in the comment section, there are a lot of suggestions on which brands are the best. So definitely think about it, and also perhaps look into the used market and see if you can get a good deal. It definitely is a game changer when it comes to hemming knit, especially, and doing binding. And Alex says, Pfaff has an IDT, which is a built-in walking foot. It's superb. It also operates on the reverse. Well, that could perhaps be a good option to look into them, because then obviously you will have more control with the feeding issue. And Stan says, mine are the Singer models. I couldn't afford a baby lock. Lol, I feel your pain. Baby lock, I've actually invested in a baby lock serger now, but I was heavily taken aback by the price. Let me say that. In my case, and this is actually true, I had to switch jobs. That wasn't the reason why I switched jobs, but I had to switch jobs in order to be able to afford the baby lock. That's true story. Not every type of working situation allows for investing in a baby lock, unfortunately, but they're fantastic machines. And KS says, yes, Pfaff has built-in dual feed. That's really good, yeah. So Pfaff definitely looks promising for sewing with knits there. Emma says, I use Brother LS14S with a walking foot. It's okay, but I feel that a more advanced sewing machine would be better. I mainly use a Brother M3 3/4D overlocker for seams, and tomorrow I'll have the CV3550 delivered. That's the Brother cover stitch machine, which is a pretty unique one because it sews a top cover stitch as well, which is the one that you'll see in most professional like activewear. It's a little bit of a difference. I talk about that in the video as well. So if you want to have a very like professional finish, that's the next level for sure. And I also done a first impression review on that machine on my blog. And Janome also has a dual feed called AccuFeed. And Collection of Unseen Nature says, I use my Janome Skyline 5. I used walking foot, less foot pressure, and double needle. It went well. Now I got a serger, Janome, and the difference is huge. Yeah, it really is. I think there's no way around it, especially as I said, it comes down to your expectations of what the end result will be. And also, there's one aspect when it comes to serger versus a sewing machine. If you're using those overlock seams, it looks quite similar to serger stitch. I'm going to now, because I've done some samples, because I wanted to be very like well prepared to explain. So hopefully this will make sense to you guys. So here, the upper row here, this one is a sewing machine overlock seam. So it's done on this sewing machine. It's done using the Bernina stretch stitch presser foot, because it makes it easy to overlock the edges. To be honest, I'm not a huge fan sometimes, because it also can make the it's a bit tricky to get it to properly stay on post. It slips a little bit because it has such a small surface. It's almost like a zipper needle and a zipper presser foot. Anyways, back to this. This is the sewing machine overlock. Now, if we flip it over, now I stretch it out. This is a very stretchy cotton rib. So I stretch it out on purpose so you can see. This is the situation you can sometimes end up with when you're doing it on a regular sewing machine. This is a 3-thread wide overlock done on my serger. This looks like this, and then we flip it over. See? No wavy stuff. Yeah, that is definitely one advantage of using the serger, because then with here I increased the differential feed a little bit because it's such a stretchy fabric, and I was able to sew this really flat. This seam takes about a second, poof, and I've stitched this. This one takes because the sewing presser foot goes back and forth, feeds back and forth. So this takes like, okay, maybe I'm exaggerating, but it feels like this takes 30 seconds or at least 20 seconds, and this takes like 1 or 2 seconds. I'm taking these numbers totally in the air, but you know, that's the feeling when you're sewing with a sewing machine overlock compared to a serger overlock stitch. So yeah, that can also like makes an experience different when it comes to sewing. And Paul Smith says, I've used a Singer Heavyweight 4423, the stretch stitch on tidy locking. I've used the Vintage Singer 319K for twin needle stitching, and it's easy to adjust the bobbin tension. Yeah, to be honest, I think for a successful twin needle, probably bobbin tension is probably needed. Shares a great book, follow me right now, thank you so much. Libby says, speaking about the class that she's teaching and where they're sewing activewear, Libby says, we use narrow zigzag for seams and wide zigzag for stretching on leg and waist elastic, fold it over and zigzag again. We practice stretching while feeding the fabric first. It's the hardest part. Yeah, that's a bring point. You bring up a great point, Libby, because that's like, you have to train how to handle the fabric. And when you're sewing like stretchy swimwear, and you're sewing elastic, you also need to have some stretch in. I actually have an example here that I'm going to show you guys. This is a neckline sewn on a regular sewing machine. And as you probably have noticed, if you try to stitch, this is a very stretchy rayon, very stretchy, but pretty stretchy rayon, very thin stretchy rayon lycra fabric. If you try to stitch down a neckline on this type of fabric on a regular sewing machine, you will experience a lot of stretch out, bad things going on, and sometimes skip stitches as well, not fun. But the trick here is to use elastic. Here I am actually using clear elastic. So I first attach this using zigzag stitches, a first row, then I fold it over and top stitch using zigzag again. This is the same principle that is used in swimwear for leg opening, for the neckline and back and things like that, all the openings, just to keep it in check. It looks this on the reverse side. You see there are 2 rows of zigzag. It doesn't look too pretty on the inside, but of course I use contrasting thread so you can see what I'm talking about. But the clear elastic, as you can see, makes this, I would argue, just as well looking as flat as even as you've done it on a cover stitch machine, to be honest. And you can also use this technique with a twin needle for sure. So if you're definitely, that could be an option as well if you just want to do a simple fold. And I also show this method in my book Sewing Activewear as well if you want to see how it's done on a sewing machine. So clear elastic can be your best friend when you're sewing stretch knits on a sewing machine, and of course other type of elastic as well. So yeah, go back to Libby's point there. Definitely a zigzag stitch is very, very valuable when you're sewing those super stretchy fabrics for sure. And Jan says, I used an awl yesterday and boy did it work. Yes, Jay for the awl. I would like to get some sponsor money from some awl companies. Please contact me. No, I'm just kidding. I talk about this so much, and it's such a game changer with so many things. And I have done several videos about that as well, but it really makes a huge difference to control the fabric. And Alex says, with FAF machine that have IDT, you can use any needle, including twin needles, not sure about other machines. Rory says, sewing knits on the Benina works out great. I have a small herd of all the black Singers. Neki, another vintage machine from the 50s and 60s, and they were not built for knits. Yes, I very much agree with your experience. My first knit experiment was with a Singer as well from the 60s, just like you say, Rory. My mother's sewing machine. So I was sewing knit jersey boat neck with white straps. This was in the 80s, so it was apricot or some other pastel, very pinkish apricot color. And I tried, and to be honest, felt kind of like I failed using that machine. So, but when I invested in that, when I was about 19, I invested in that Husqvarna from the early 70s. Big game changer. So, but yeah, those older machines, so they must have done something. I'm not a technician, to be honest, but if you know exactly what it is, but just like Rory says, something very substantial had happened between that time and the way they sew knits are way better. And we have an old fan as well. Pauline says, I found the old brilliant tool. I discovered this from watching your vlogs. Many thanks. Thank you so much. Thumbs up, says Pauline as well. Anniken says, I'm using a Husqvarna Viking. Now you're saying, now I'm mixing Swedish now because we say Husqvarna in Swedish. That's why it sounds a little bit odd. I'm using a Husqvarna Viking Opal 670. It has manual adjustment for the pressure of the foot. Yeah, that really seems to be a game changer. And my next sewing machine, I will definitely look into having that feature. And Libby says, but in spite of our success sewing knits on a regular sewing machine, I still love my surgeries and cover stitching, of course. Yes, same, Libby, same. And Emma says, I agree, the overlock serger takes seconds, whereas the sewing machines to take forever. Yes, and I forgot to mention one other painful thing about sewing these very durable overlock stitches on a sewing machine. They are a nightmare to rip, and especially if you're sewing very thin, delicate knit fabric. I have never successfully been able to rip a stitch like this without poking some holes in the fabric. If you have any tips, I would love to know, because that is also one of the reasons that I don't want to use the sewing machine too much for sewing when knits. So definitely check before you sew. That's a really good suggestion when it comes to using a sewing machine for knits. And Lena says, I'm really bad or a bit miserable with doing curves and turns on both cover stitch and serger. Yeah, the cover stitch machine is not really done to do curves, but there are some hacks for that as well. I think if you check on YouTube, you can see some people showing the tricks there, but you're basically pivoting and you're stitching a seam back and then forth, and on a serger you have to, like, again, I personally, when I do corner of if you're talking like middle corner, so it goes like this, then I open it up. So I try to stitch almost like a straight thing. I'm sure other people have better serger techniques for that particular, but I try to open it up so I can get the needles and everything as close to the edge of the fabric. So that's one of the tricky things. So again, which is also what I'm going to bring back now when I'm talking about the cardigan, which in some cases a sewing machine can be superior because you have so much more control regarding that. And just, it's good to know with the clear elastic. And Slow Mellow also talks about the fact that all the sewing machines from the 50s and the 60s were not optimized for knits because they were not widely available back then. And also the sewing machines that I have, they are not really optimized for lycra fabrics and spandex, because in the 70s and 80s this was very much novelty fabric. But nowadays, to be honest, I'm struggling because I really like to work with 100% cotton jersey when I'm sewing t-shirts. I like the feel of that, but it has gotten really hard to find here locally where I live, because every cotton jersey seems to have about 5% lycra, or sometimes even more. And while that's great, it also changes the hand of the fabric, and I love the drape and the soft feel of just using 100% cotton. And also it's also easier to sew on a sewing machine. Yes, anyway, so I was going to talk now a bit about some of the tricks that I employed when I was sewing this cardigan. So I'm just going to take this up so I can see what I'm talking about. Yeah, this cardigan, should I probably put it on? I'm going to make a really bad example demonstrating this, but this cardigan is sewn with a variety of different sewing machine stitches, and so I'm going to run through them now. First of all, as we talked about, clear elastic is your best friend when you're sewing knits on a sewing machine. So if you're going to start now, the shoulder seam here, I use clear elastic to stabilize that, because again, the shoulder seam is slanted, and that means there's even more risk that for stretch out situations, especially if you're using a sewing machine with no differential feed. So definitely use clear elastic. And when you're using clear elastic on a sewing machine, perhaps, I don't know if you can tell, but it's actually 2 rows of zigzag stitches. The reason for that is that I first attach the elastic on the back piece of the bodice, always attached on the back piece, and then with the zigzag stitch, because clear elastic is a little bit slippery and it's kind of hard to sew in a sewing machine. It tends to, you know, go over the place, you know. So I like to attach that first, and then I stitch a second row using a narrow zigzag stitch. So that's how I secure this one, and did a shoulder seam. So that's the first bit. And for the side seams, I actually, again, you can't tell because I use matching thread, but I just use good old regular narrow zigzag stitch. And this fabric has a decent amount of stretch. It's a double knit with some lycra in it. And here for the collar, again, you can't see because it's such a dark thread, I'm sorry about that, but I use the overlock stitches on the sewing machine here in the neckline to keep this from stretching. It's a good idea to actually use some fusible wonder tape. Sorry, double-sided wonder tape. I'm going to pull that off now. It looks like this. This one is really good because it washes away. So if you want to attach, for instance, a collar to a knit garment and you're using a sewing machine, you have problems with it stretching out the neckline, just attach the the water-soluble, it's hard sometimes when I speak in English, the water-soluble double-sided tape, stitch together pieces, then when you wash the garment, the tape disappears, but you have kept the seams in check. And my third trick when it comes to sewing on a regular sewing machine, which I am a big fan of, and it works on most knits apart from thin, stretchy lycra knits, and that is to use the blind hem on your regular sewing machine. So if you look at this, you can't really see any stitches on the front, right? That is because of the magic of the regular good old sewing machine blind hem stitch. And see, it stretches quite well. You know, I've never had any stitches popping, and I've had this, as I said, for 10 years. So that's also a really good idea. I use the same technique for the pockets. See? No stitching because I used the regular sewing machine blind hem stitch. It's absolutely fantastic, and I think most sewing machines comes with this stitch and definitely also this presser foot. If not, definitely invest in one because that's also an excellent stitch option for using when you're using a regular sewing machine. And another thing that I also want to talk about, which I think is super important when it comes to sewing knits, especially if you want to have, because I'm a really big fan of doing like structured thing or stretchy knit, which is kind of a tricky thing to do. So for instance here, the front placket here, it has, this is inspired by a cardigan from J. Crew, so it actually has the side seams visibly on the outside pressed apart. So that's a design detail which I thought was cool. Again, I had to do this using a regular narrow zigzag stitch and then I press it apart. So I couldn't do that using a serger. And this part where I have the buttons, these are actually stabilized using fusible. And this is a knit fusible. It's a fantastic fusible. And I've linked in the description section about the various knit fusible interfacing. And this is really good to make yourself familiar with because again, that will make sewing knits on a sewing machine much easier. I thought I had a piece, yeah. This is one of my favorites, and this one that I used here. It's it has like a herringbone look almost, and it stretches in all directions. So it's really, really good. How you can see there, you can see that kind of pattern. So it has stretches in all directions. But so that's a really good thing. It adds stability, but it doesn't make the fabric rigid. So this is my favorite one, but there are also other ones which I talk about in that blog post. So definitely also considering adding fusibles to knits if you are having some type of problems, especially if you're doing like collars and doing like a collar stand. Again, really good to have. Oh my god, I got a super chat. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nelly from Collection of Unseen Nature. That is not happening very much. Thank you so much. Because you know that you can actually donate if you want and if you like this. If you want to show some support, you can use a super chat. If you want to donate something, I'd love to that. I will be very, very grateful. No pressure, of course, but that's a function if you want to support in some way. And so thank you so much. Thank you, Nelly. Auntie Stitches says, I use a narrow zigzag on very thin polyester jersey and it was easier than adjusting the Cover Pro. But I used the Cover Pro for thickened cotton jersey and it worked once I fit new needles. Yeah. So it all depends on the fabric. Sometimes fabrics can be a nightmare to sew on the Coverstitch machine as well. And Virginia says, is the clear elastic the same thing was sometimes included in ready-to-wear dresses to hang around the hanger so the dress doesn't slip off? I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm not sure. The clear elastic looks like a thinner version of, a slippery version of like those invisible bra straps, but it's like thinner and not as dense. But maybe. And we also have someone from New Zealand here. Hi, Michelle. So she's probably up early because it's early morning Monday there. And Collection says, was very Collection of Once in Nature who gave me the wonderful super chat. Thank you again. I'm happy to learn from you and appreciate all the knowledge you are passing forward. Thank you so much. That means a lot. Thank you. I'm very touched by this gesture. So these are some of the things that one does need to consider when sewing stretching knits. So basically you can need to experiment a little bit with finding different type of stitches and stuff. Let me see if I had some more examples. Yeah. So what I was trying to say now is if you are trying to plan a project just using a regular sewing machine, I think the most things you have to consider is your fabric choices. So for instance, if you are using very soft, supple fabric, then maybe you will not be as happy with the result, or it won't perhaps 100% match the expectations, look like a ready-to-wear garment. But if you're sewing, I would say, to be honest, maybe 85% of knit types available will be very much successful using a regular sewing machine. And also we got an answer now on the clear elastic, if that's the same as the hanger. Jack says it's the same, but the hanging garment usually use a narrow version. Oh, maybe that's a really good way of finding, reusing that one, because I had no idea about maps. It's like different from different countries, or maybe I've not noticed it lately. But that's really good to know. So clear elastic comes in lots of different versions, and I'm going to show you a couple here. I would definitely also say that buy good quality clear elastic, because there are definitely difference between good and bad. Sometimes tends to break. Sometimes they are a bit too dense. This is one that I really like. It has some stability, some stretch. So it's just perfect, the perfect mix of stability and stretch if you're sewing like shoulder seams and necklines, for instance. But if you're sewing a knit dress that has or any type of garment that has a seam at the waist, for instance, if you're sewing like a knit wrap dress that has a separate bodice and a skirt, then to stabilize it, I would actually use a bit of thicker, more wider clear elastic, because this one has more stability. As you notice, it has also less stretch. So again, you have to be mindful that it might make the garment less stretchy. But if you're not working with too much negative ease, then I would say that this is a way better idea as well. So that's all the options definitely you can explore when it comes to clear elastic. I think there are probably more versions as well, but these are the two that I want. And the one I'm holding up here now, obviously, as you can see, looks more similar to the ones that sometimes is called like invisible bra straps. And I think perhaps, I'm not sure if these can be used for that purpose, but they're very, very like stable and really easy to work with. Whereas this one, as I said, you might need to touch it with a zigzag stitch or a dab of stick glue just to keep it in check. But I would say if you are sewing regular knits, either invest in clear elastic, or another option as well is to use some type of fusible stave tape that has some stretch in it. There are lots of different brands there, but the one is more available here is from Flisselina, which also has a little bit of stretch, and it also has a stitch that keeps it a little bit in check. So this is actually also a really good product to get. So you definitely need to consider what type of tools you need. I would definitely look into that as well. I know some also are really fond of using water soluble stabilizer, again, just to keep that in check when you're doing hemming and stuff like that. Yes. If you have any more questions about sewing minutes, I'd love to know. For me personally, I think in the last few years I've been so much into using my serger and my Coverstitch machine, so I kind of a little bit has left this bound by the wayside, but every time I bring it back, I definitely am still pleasantly surprised on how good it performs. And I will also give you another book tip, which I think is the best book, in my humble opinion, that is written about sewing with knits. This one is a little bit of an older book. I think it's made in the early 2000s. And this one talks a lot about techniques to use when you just have a regular sewing machine. So I learned tons and tons and tons from this book. It's by Connie Long. It's definitely worth hunting down. I don't think it's like still being printed, but definitely you can find it on Amazon and stuff like that. You see how well I have read this book. I'm very well thumbed, and it has so many ideas on stitches on a regular sewing machine. Another tip you can also do, there's a link in the description section where you can get access to, if you don't have my book Sewing Activewear, there is a guide in that book with all the type of sewing machine stitches that you can use for stretching knits. But that particular page or that guide is also available as a downloadable PDF. So if you check in the description section, you will actually see where you can download that guide, and you will get that delivered, and also get some email tips from me then about sewing knits and how different techniques you can use, for instance, when it comes to ribbing, and other tips when it comes to knits. Also, I forgot a very important topic as well. We haven't talked about needles, right? That is also really, really important. You shouldn't use your regular universal needles in many cases because it can lead to skip stitches. But sometimes a universal needle, because universal needle actually has a small ballpoint, so it's not like it doesn't have a ballpoint, but a stretch needle has a more pronounced ballpoint, and that helps with preventing skip stitches, which can also be an issue when you are using a regular sewing machine. I like the needles called Super Stretch when it's from Oregon. They're called Stretch when they're from Schmetz, and there are probably other brands who have similar ones. The fun thing about Schmetz needle brands is that they also have a needle called Jersey needle, and that is for more stable knits, which hasn't like a lycra or spandex edition, whereas the stretch needle from Schmetz, that's called Stretch, that is actually done for those more stretchy fabrics. If you're sewing swimwear, activewear, stretchy cotton lycra fabrics, then you should probably instead use this stretch needle rather than Jersey one. But Oregon calls it Super Stretch, Schmetz calls it Stretch. Those are really good options. And I also done a blog post about that as well, again with lots of comments, with also some insights on this topic. So that's super, super important. So I'd love to know if you have any recommendation as well when it comes to needles, and if you noticed any difference between using a regular universal needle and one of these. Definitely don't be afraid also sometimes to go a bit bigger, because you don't really have to worry too much about getting holes on most fabrics. Just do a sample first. But I personally find that a regular size 75 or 80 works really well. Sometimes I even use a 90 needle depending on the fabric. Especially I find that if I have problems with skip stitches on knits, especially when I'm sewing over lots of layers, to be honest, I find that 90 solves a lot of that problems actually. So yeah, that's very much so. Oh, and Rode, hi Rode. She says thank you for another super informative chat session, Jenna. Have a great week. Thank you so much, Rode. So if you have any more questions, please shout away. And otherwise, well, I think we're about to close this chat. Or if you have any more tips, of course, I'll do my best to answer that. As I said, this time I took a lot of time adding tons of different resources in the description section to help you get more further into this. And if we should perhaps round up the discussion, I would say you can definitely sew knits with a sewing machine, but it seems like everyone who gets a surgery definitely feels like it's a game changer. And that's my personal opinion as well. But you know, it all depends on your budget and, you know, your room and all those stuff. I definitely think that using a lot of tips and tricks, you can definitely achieve so much more than we perhaps give the sewing machine credit for, because sometimes I can feel there's a chase of getting so much equipment and we don't really fully utilize what a good regular sewing machine can do. Because, and also remember that a serger, and especially a coverstitch machine, also has a learning curve. You will have more control with a sewing machine because of the lack of speed and some other ways as well. So yeah, that's probably my final words here. Alex says thank you, Johanna, thank you. Jack says thank you so much, thank you. Collection says tack så hjärtligt, which means thank you so very much or very heartily. Jackie says the organ super stretch needles are HA1SP. They also said ordinary stretch, and also do both, not just stretch. Yeah, so Organ also has the same versions there. Thank you, that's really good to know. Organ is a really good needle brand. I to be honest, like Organ and Schmetz the best. I'm sure there are other ones, but I've also had some bad experience as well. For this Gross, for instance, the twin needle I have, not as good, to be honest, as the Schmetz and the Organs. And Susan said, thank you so much as well, Johanna. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I am so honored that all of you people wanted to come here and chat about one of my favorite topics, with is sewing with knits. So I hope that you feel even more inspired to do even more knits if you aren't already. And also I love that you have contributed so much to the discussion, because I, as always, learned so much myself. This is like a sewing school for me as well, because I get so much information for you guys as well, which is also why I love doing these chats, that we can have this constant information exchange and we can all improve our skills, which is absolutely one of the things I love about sewing. So yes, that's I'm very, very grateful for that you come here and have a chat and about one of our favorite things, namely sewing. So that was all for me, and I wish you a great week now, and have lots of fun sewing with knits as well. Bye bye.